Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the monastery, the open bar of the internet, the world's greatest shit show, and the place where we, the good brothers and sisters of this most holy of temples, seek enlightenment through the drunkest, craziest, and most batshit ways possible. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me I have a returning good brother into the temple, coming to us from Saga Machine, as well as Tab Creations. Previously here for things like Age of Ambition, the Against the Dark Yogi, Dime Adventures, and now coming back with the second edition of Shadows over Soul, which we've covered adventures for on this series. The one and only Thorin Tabor. How you doing today, man?
I'm good. How are you?
I am doing good. August has been a interesting month, but at the very least it's started to cool down a little bit. And by a little bit, I mean I'm not dealing with triple digits and blazing sun when I go outside. As befitting of my gimmick, I will always be a winter person, because when it gets cold, you can just put another layer on.
Oh yeah.
So, I think the last time I had you on, you were doing Strange Bedfellows, the module for Age of Ambition, and
that's right.
With Shadows over Soul was I remember a while back you had done this survey of sorts about where to take the next iteration of Saga Machine. And a few playtests here and there, which I wasn't able to cover per se because every time I finished the script, some new version would come around. So I didn't want to play an eternal game of catch up.
Yeah.
But is this the first of what's going to be multiple second editions within the line?
That looks likely. I mean, while we haven't completely committed to doing other second editions, the idea was if this does well, we'd look at our other game lines for second editions, and this seems to be doing well so far. So I'm very happy with that, and I can't put names or dates to it, but it seems likely, yeah.
Yeah. So obviously one of the big shifts is the fact that it looks like you're going with a D10 approach. And I am curious if it's going to be a case where it's D10 for those who want dice and playing cards for those who prefer the old method.
Yeah. So in the first edition of Shadows over Soul, the main body of the book had the mechanic using playing cards, and there was an appendix in the back for playing with D10s. And after a lot of user feedback and playtest iterations, what we just finally decided on is we're going to present both of those mechanics co-equally in the main body of the book, and just change some of the wording to be kind of agnostic depending whether you're using cards or dice. So rather than saying making a flip, we're saying making a test. You can make a test with the die, you can make a test with the cards. Mm-hmm. For the quick start that is currently out in Drive-Thru RPG, we did only put the D10 version of the rules in there simply because we thought that'd be easier for people who are completely new to it to pick up, and we were very limited in page space in the quick start. So, but the core book will present them equally. There'll be both the mechanic using poker cards and the mechanic using a D10.
Yeah. It is funny that we ended up talking about the OGL fiasco the last time you're on, because I believe for this one you're using the Orc license. That's the plan. It's having looked at the various license options that are out there, I wish there was like one community standard the way there used to be with OGL, but there doesn't seem to be. But out of the many options, I think Orc fits us the best. So that's what we've decided to go with. Given who it has stewardship over the Orc license, that certainly makes sense. Because I know a lot of people are looking at it as if it's owned by Paizo. That's not the case. It's owned by the Azor Law. Paizo is just the first client. Mm-hmm.
And they've got a good number. They've got a number of big games that seem to have signed on with it, which gives it some breadth.
Yeah.
And it's nice that they've got that sort of independent stewardship there with the Azor Law.
Yeah, because the Azor Law Group helped pen the original Open Gaming license back in 2000, which certainly helps matters. But
oh yeah.
Given the fact that this is using its own system, I'd imagine that changing around wording wasn't too difficult, going from putting your stuff in the OGL versus putting your stuff in the Orc license.
Yeah, it wasn't too difficult.
Yeah. Now, with that in mind, because I know, even though I've covered it a couple times, I know this is going to be some people's first exposure to Shadows over Soul. What sort of media do you suppose would fit the Appendix N, for lack of a better term, of Shadows over Soul?
The sort of inspirations.
Inspirations, reference media, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So I like to sometimes describe Shadows over Soul as The Expanse crossed with Alien and a dash of cyberpunk thrown in. So those are all inspirations. I'm a big fan of all three of those. Other ones I might want to throw in there. The Thing, 1982 John Carpenter film, is a big sort of inspiration of mine for sci-fi horror. Europa Report, I think, is fairly underrated and is much more recent. And there's other Europa Report. Hard sci-fi and sci-fi horror games out there, which I've certainly played as they're not exactly like Shadows over Soul, but I remember I going through and playing things, just trying to figure out like what's out there, what are people going to inevitably compare it to. And I've played Transhuman Space, which is powered by GURPS, and I've played Mothership, because I know one of the newer popular sci-fi horror games out there. And Eclipse Phase, I think, was in the height of its popularity back when we first did the Shadows over Soul 1E a decade ago. And it's got a newer second edition that's, I don't know, 5 years old or something at this point.
Yeah, more or less. I didn't do an interview about second edition Eclipse Phase, but I did a general interview about that years ago. Which I realized is redundant coming from me, given how many guests I've had over the last 5 years. But it seems to me that if somebody's coming into this with a bit of knowledge from first edition, are there any major changes that they'd need to be aware of in terms of shifts from first to second?
So in terms of shifts from first to second, I'll break it up into the two pieces. Setting or lore and system. So setting-wise, I've changed very little. I debated how much to revise, because a decade has passed and people's views of science fiction stuff have changed. I ultimately decided to keep it more or less the same, so it'll be familiar to people, and the 1E book setting-wise will be entirely compatible in that sense. In terms of the system, however, we've spent a lot of time streamlining character creation. I'm personally a big fan of. I like lots of a deep amount of customization in general in role-playing games. I'm a fan of that. But a lot of our surveys and stuff we've done when doing Saga Machine Second Edition, how people actually play the games. A lot of people, in particular, play horror games as one-shots. So I wanted a character creation system that would be very quick to generate characters if you're just wanted to turn out a quick one-shot, but also give you a fair amount of deeper customization options if you wanted to sit down and go that path. I think we've struck a pretty good balance in second edition, streamlining character creation to meeting both of those sort of use cases. As already mentioned, we're presenting the card-based mechanic and the D10-based mechanic kind of co-equally in the book, so that is a change. The other thing that really got a fairly significant revision is the combat system. Just the way it's structured. First edition had a structure where there was a declaration phase, and you'd go 3, 2, 1 for the particular action phases that you had declared actions in, and that gave a certain amount of it had good and bad aspects to it. It was pretty good because the declaration phase was kind of intense in that you didn't really know how things would unfold, and there was a certain loss of control there that I thought was very evocative of horror. But on the other hand, it got kind of clunky at times, and I think the new 3 action point, just kind of everyone gets a turn system is much faster to resolve, and I think that benefits the sort of scenes where the GM can just focus on the tone, the mood, the feel of what it is to get into sort of life-threatening combat without having to worry with all the fiddly bits as much.
And I think the other thing is when you have that clip approach, it can result in some people. I'm not sure if this was something that you saw when you were doing the surveys, but result in people playing defensive more often than not.
Yeah, that is very true.
And worst case scenario, I could see an instance where people end up playing it almost like it's a Mexican standoff.
Yeah, no, I've definitely, when it comes to these sort of high lethality sort of horror games, it's just a phenomenon I've noticed where there are certain players out there who will be like, oh my god, I'm in a horror, I'm gonna play everything as smart and defensive as I possibly can to do everything not to die. There's other players who are like, oh great, I'm in a horror film. Let's split up so we can cover more ground that way. I'm going to embrace the fact that I'm going to die. And it's really kind of interesting seeing how just different groups tilt in that, you know?
Oh yeah. And obviously, from a design perspective, you have to find a way to accommodate both, which is not an easy thing.
Oh yeah, no, it's definitely a tricky thing to do at times.
It is very much like walking a tightrope. But it sounds like you have essentially a action point approach, which with every action taking a certain amount.
Basically, most actions are just one, trying to keep it simple. But essentially, each round you'll take either a fast turn or a slow turn, and on your turn, you've got 3 action points in which to take actions, and typically limited to 1 attack in there. But it's basically, draw your weapon, fire, and reload, or something like that. Or move, to take cover, fire, and aim, or something along those lines. You can also hold back actions to take reactions too, if you do want to play defensively.
Yeah.
You can hold actions back to take a dodge or a parry, depending.
Yeah. I think some will have a bit of an adjustment period in terms of not falling into the trope of rolling for initiative, but just going with a popcorn initiative, essentially.
Yeah, if I had to compare it to something, I would compare it to a Shadow of the Demon Lord. I think is a fairly similar system where you declare a fast turn or a slow turn.
Yes.
And that brings how things resolve. And then when the players are taking their fast turns, they just go in whatever order they want among themselves, and then same with the slow turns.
Yeah, and it's been a while since first edition, but I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the stress and panic system you got with second edition, and how that sort of escalating stress acting as a double-edged sword is going to be a major thing in second edition. Is that something that's new, or was that hinted at in first?
We had an optional stress system that was presented in the supplement in first, but it wasn't really a core part of the game like it is in second. I think that really kind of helps press home the horror aspects of the sci-fi horror, and GMs who don't want to play into that as much can simply just not call for panic tests as often as they otherwise might.
That certainly makes sense. I'm guessing that's part of the reason why you have this this stress boon when it comes to having the stress consequence.
Yeah. I think of it as kind of a push your luck sort of mechanic there, where you can voluntarily take a stress boon, and it does help increase your chance of succeeding and pulling yourself out of a tight spot, but it also increases your chance of panicking and making things worse.
Which certainly fits the card aspect of things.
Yeah.
And I think one of the other big things that really stood out to me, and I'm guessing this will carry over into the full book, is there's a much bigger emphasis on color coding in the text.
Yeah, this is something we've done more as our books have gone along, but just I'm trying, and when it comes to just general layout and design and trying to make stand out to the reader and the GM running it the important parts quickly. I've tried to pull out the various consequences you might impose, or the tests you're telling the players to make in a different color, and try to make things easy in play.
Yeah. And now with that in mind, I do want to cover some of the highlights that you have on the Kickstarter page. And the first one that really comes to mind is hacking. A lot of games, both science fiction and cyberpunk, have some form of hacking system, And this has been one of those things that's been tricky to handle because it's been done very often where hacking is almost a duet between the hacker and the GM. I mean, yeah, you can have multiple hackers, but let's be honest, nobody builds their party like that. That'd be like having that'd be like a fantasy game where you have two wizards in the party. Does it happen? Yeah, but that's not how people construct this sort of thing. Everybody wants to be in their particular niche.
Mm-hmm.
So with
Yeah.
Shadows over Soul, how are you handling hacking to make sure that everybody is involved in some form?
Yeah, I've played plenty of, old editions of Shadowrun are a good example, where hacking's kind of its own minigame, and the hacker sits there and plays their own minigame for 20 minutes as everyone sits and waits.
Mm-hmm.
And it's genuinely fun if you're the hacker, but it's not so fun if you're everyone else waiting for it to be done.
Mm-hmm.
So what I've tried to do in one of my goals here in Shadows over Soul with its hacking system is that just try and get everyone involved. So basically, when you're doing the hacking system, you're collecting what's called exploits, and then eventually the hacker's going to make some tests once they've collected enough exploits to see if they can get through. But exploits are basically ways they can narrow down the parameters of their hacking attempt to get in. For example, and you can get exploits not just through sitting there, typing things and whatever you're doing, but also doing a broader investigation. So, for example, your face character might go through and try to, talk to, I don't know, security guards or something like that, learn what they can about, the target of your hacking. And that could count as an exploit if you know a bit about, the guy whose password whose computer you're trying to hack or something like that, because you can figure out what sorts of systems you would use or security or however you want to justify that. If you can learn, do more research learning about him, I don't know, his native language or whatever, you can, to give a real life example, you can often use all these Unicode characters for passwords, but the truth is, like, the ones in your keyboard are exponentially more common than emojis. Like, very few people have a password that's like smiley face emoji, repeat 12 times or so, or some variation like that. So if you know what language he speaks or what sort of interface he's using, that can give you a clue about what his keys are likely to be, and that's that can count as an exploit. And so that so you might have some sort of infiltration character break in and learn stuff like that, or some sort of detective tail him home and something along those lines. So these are the sort of things, gaining exploits that can involve the whole party, depending on how the GM wants to frame that. And then at the end, the hacker gets to do their thing, making their tests, or sometimes if it's an extended action, a series of 3 tests, applying bonuses from these exploits.
Yep. And the way you describe it, maybe I'm off base on this, but the way you describe it, it very much reminds me of Ocean's 11.
Yeah, that's a pretty good analogy there, yeah.
Because, I mean, yeah, hacking is not the biggest part of it, but consider that the heist is this combination of a bunch of people doing a bunch of different con jobs in order to get across a very, very complicated lock. And it's hacking if not getting across a very complicated lock with extra steps.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm guessing within the full book there will be a few examples to help ease people into that concept, since there is still the brain rot of having that one person as a designated hacker in a party.
Yeah, there's a few example blocks and just kind of example hacking setups. One of the things we've tried to do in this edition, just in general, not just in hacking but overall, is provide a lot more example blocks, because there are certainly people that understand things a lot better when they read an example than just kind of reading the rules. and I'm one of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But with that in mind, you've in the bullet points you also talk about campaign options for the different styles of horror, going from survival horror to action horror. Would it be fair for me to say that you're running the gamut between, say, the original Alien to Aliens? In that,
Oh, absolutely.
As an analogy for that.
Yeah, that the difference between Aliens 1 and 2 is the exact example I usually give when talking about the different styles of horror.
Yeah, since Aliens is far more of an action horror, mostly because Cameron outright admitted that he couldn't do anything like the original Aliens, so he didn't try to.
Mm-hmm.
But
I think both those films are very great examples when they to different approaches to horror, and they both work really well.
Mm-hmm.
But when I think about the different modes of horror in general, I think about it's like, what's the relation of the main characters, the PCs,
mm-hmm.
to the horror, right? Like survival horror, your relation is real. Basically, you're just trying to live to the end. Like defeating the horror is, for the most part, probably outside your abilities. Whether it's skills or equipment or whatever, and you're just trying to live the dawn.
Yeah.
Whereas the action, like investigative horror, which is our kind of middle ground, call it. Your characters have the tools available to them and the skills and equipment to look into the horror and possibly even like confront it briefly, but a head-on confrontation is probably still beyond them.
Mm-hmm.
The action horror, like you've got the gear and the skills to potentially face it head on and maybe even live.
Mm-hmm. And I've seen. I suppose another, even though it doesn't call itself that, I suppose another example of action horror would be the original Predator.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe Predator 2 if I wanted to stretch things a little bit. But
I'm gonna admit, I actually haven't seen Predator 2. It's been on my to watch list for decades, but
I would
I've
like
seen the first one.
Yeah, one of these days I would like to get a feel for what the sales pitch was like. Since it was going from the jungle to the concrete jungle, but that's another matter entirely.
Yeah.
Now, one of the other things that was brought up was the engineering system. Now, item creation and item modding is one of those other tricky ones where not because of a duet, but a lot of games have a very complicated way of handling item creation and a very specific way of handling it.
Yeah.
But how do you have it so that you have the idea of somebody inventing or somebody hacking together to do something while not going overcomplicated with it, which is the common trap.
Yeah, so our engineering system is essentially a variation of our extended action rules.
Mm-hmm.
So the general idea of our extended action rules is there's a series of 3 tests, or sometimes up to 3, and you've got to accumulate a certain margin of success between them, and you can use that to frame, I don't know, sort of social conflicts, or in this case engineering, or other sort of extended things where you want to string the players along and not just make it a single roll. So basically, the way this works is it's a series of 2 or 3 tests that the engineer is going to make, and other people can help. but there's basically it's a concept test, a prototype test, and then optionally a QA test, essentially. And depending on the amount of margin of success, that's how much you are over success you accumulate. Then you need a certain amount to make it work, and then a certain amount to make it work without issue. And there's a fairly large kind of between space between those two numbers, where it works, but it may have some bug or side effect that can make things interesting, narratively there. So that's so it there are a little more rules than that, because there's some basic rules for the amount of time or materials you need to throw at things, or money if you don't have materials in hand and have the ability to buy stuff. But that's essentially the other than some time and material requirements, that's essentially how it works. The player describes what they're trying to do. The GM sets a difficulty for this extended action based on it, and then the players they can work together to gather that money or resources or eat and other sort of things, or but then you just do this series of 2 to 3 tests. The third one being the QA is optional, and it can help you work out those bugs, but it costs more time and resources. So you might, if you're pressed for time, you might want to or have to drop that, and then go off and you either have your working thingamabob or you don't.
Which certainly fits. It's I will admit that when I think of some of the bigger offenders with item creation, I'm thinking of certain fantasy games where the system for item creation was a small chapter in and of itself. And I'll be flat out honest. A lot of item crafting rules in a lot of games I'm not a big fan of, because the materials for it are so specific. And I think of how the fantasy of somebody who's essentially MacGyvering some tech to work is not really concerned about that kind of specificity of material, and usually is more concerned with taking whatever is in hand and making it work through percussive maintenance or not.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, and if I had to use a more real world example, consider how somebody who's far more adept at cooking is not going to really be thinking about the recipe all that much, and is probably going to mess around with the parts of a given recipe with time.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
Like, I think of, because of where I'm from, I think about stuff like hot dish and how there's like a million different variations on it, depending on who you ask and depending what where they are. Same thing can be said for any sort of regional dish in any part of the country or any part of the planet. Everybody's gonna have their own spin. But you look at item creation in a lot of games, and they specifically want these items, and you can't change anything about that. I'm not going to stretch that too far, but at the same time, there is that disconnect because when people are making things, they're largely flying by the seat of their pants.
Yeah, I've played a lot of games like that. That's thankfully not the route we've gone. You basically either you need some amount of sort of certain amount of money or equivalent in resources that's kind of abstract. And I figure if the GM, if you're being too ridiculous, the GM will otherwise find a way to say no. No, you can't make a nuclear bomb with a paperclip and chewing gum, and leave it to them without having to write specific rules for to make a nuclear bomb you need these 3 resources, blah 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 blah.
Yeah, I've always been in favor of abstract, because when trying to go hard realism, sometimes you end up making things unrealistic for reasons you didn't prepare for.
Yeah.
Like it. What instantly comes to mind is when it comes to tracking weight, and sometimes I would look at the weight of certain items in games and go, does anyone who wrote this actually held this? Especially in some cyberpunk and some sci-fi games regarding the weight of different firearms, and I'm like, it's not as heavy as you're making it out to be.
Yeah.
I think there was one where I think there was one case where it was doing the weight of like a claymore, and it got it completely wrong. It acted like the claymore was like twice as heavy as what an actual claymore is weight-wise.
Wow.
But with that kind of thing in mind, what is referred to in the Kickstarter by the violence system?
Oh, that's the combat system with a slightly more edgy name.
All right, I can go.
That's really all it is.
Yeah. I can certainly go with that. And obviously there's gonna be a full bestiary, but I'm not expecting, say, monster creation in that bestiary. But are you planning on having means to tweak some of the monsters if you want to make things more challenging or less challenging, or add some variation to a given monster?
Yeah. The GM chapter will have a number of tools for making monsters horrific, as I think exactly how we say it. Because like bestiaries or whatever, they're useful as a GM, and they're a great starting point. If they're very easy to like pick something and run with it.
Mm-hmm.
But they also take a certain amount of the mystery away, and horror is really kind of all about the unknown. So we recommend, like when you're grabbing something out of there, take it and tweak it in some way, like to make your players say, like, my God, I didn't know it could do that,
Mm-hmm.
And whereas there's a number of sort of like pre-made traits you can throw on as an easy and quickly to do things, but we also have some guidelines for making up your own.
Yeah, and bringing it back to the aliens analogy, if you're dealing with a bunch of military equivalent characters, you can always use the meme of intelligence is always wrong.
Yeah.
The good old, oh, we thought it could do this, we thought it couldn't do this thing. That was what the intel said, and that was right at the time. But that time may have been months or years ago.
That's true.
I've certainly done that to play around with people's assumptions, especially if they're more genre savvy.
Yeah. That's a good trick.
Mm-hmm. Now, when it comes to the archetype system that you have, because of the fact that Shadows over Soul can go so many different directions, was it an easy or was it a tricky thing to make sure that the archetypes can be a similar level of multi-purpose, especially given things like campaign options?
Yeah, that was fairly tricky. What we really did was I started like going through and rewatching a bunch of sci-fi horror movies and kind of like reviewing sort of books I've read in that genre as well, and just kind of come up with all the different like basic character types that I saw there, particularly ones that repeated over and over again or particularly iconic. And then I asked myself, how would I stat this character up with with our skill system, and then looked for overlap or try to narrow it down to several buckets of skills, essentially that would cover the archetypes, in a way that was like a useful division of the system. And in the end, we boiled it down to 8 very broad archetypes, and then we've got different examples in the book of how to make those do different sorts of characters, essentially. There are a couple that were kind of tricky in my mind. The ones that were hardest were the ones that, like, this archetype is really defined by a single skill, and it's hard to make that a whole role on its own in our game. So we probably have very specific examples for those. Like hacker is a good example, right? Like the hacker archetype is really defined by how good you are at computers. Like what other skills would you like lend to the hacker archetype? I mean, I can think of a lot of different characters that have that and some other skill, but really they're kind of defined by that one skill. So we've rolled hacking, the hacker archetype, for example, into our operative archetype. And you can make a hacker. You make an operative, and you give yourself a very good, computer skill.
Yeah, it's one of those tricky things when dealing with doing archetypes in fantasy versus doing archetypes in science fiction. In fantasy, the possible routes that a campaign can go are not as broad. They're certainly broad, but it's a case of a linear broad versus a quadratic kind of broad. To reference the old meme. And that's why even with the simplified approach with archetypes, that multi-purposeness was something I wanted to highlight. Now, with that in mind, what are you shooting for as far as the total page count for Shadows over Soul?
So the original target page count was about 240, but having gone through the layout, it's not the new layout that we've worked out is not quite as word dense as I had assuming, so it's probably going to be 10-20% more pages than that, just because we're fitting just because of the way the layout works. So let me just do the math there really quick. 240 times 2. So we'll say between 240 and 280. Is what we're shooting for now.
And I believe that you're also doing two new scenarios as part of this campaign: the Genesis Door and Prison Ship.
Yes.
What we mentioned about shifting between survival horror or action horror, where on that particular pendulum would those scenarios fit?
So the Genesis Door is definitely more to the survival horror side of the spectrum, and it's a much more I hesitate to use the word cosmic horror, but it's definitely a more what's going on is not necessarily obvious to the player characters from the start, and it adds an air of mystery to it that is kind of like figuring out what's going on as the scenario. Prison Ship, on the other hand, is I would say much more to the action horror side of the spectrum. And while I wouldn't call it straightforward, it gives you a more obvious target for the horror and what's going on.
I can certainly get that. And adventures back with first edition were pretty light, usually around 30 or so pages. Is that going to be the case with these two adventures?
But these two adventures will probably be in the 32 to 48 range. Again, things have expanded slightly, but our newer layout makes less word dense and sort of more visual stuff to look at and pick things out and make it sort of easier to flow between pages. But yeah, they'll probably be that ballpark or just a little bit more.
Which I can certainly get that. And As far as the release window, or at the very least the digital version, obviously things get more complicated once the physical books come around. What are you shooting for as far as a release window?
I want the I want the PDFs, at least the initial version, out to backers in December. Usually what happens is we will send initial version out to backers. We'll take correction reports, for typos and stuff like that for about 3 weeks a month, something along those lines, and then which we then use for printing. And so that my goal is to get the out for really all of those out in backers' hands by sometime in December.
Mm-hmm. Which certainly fits. But with that said, I do want to sincerely thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come all the way to my monastery once again and enjoy the madness that happens here.
Well, thank you for having me.
And anytime you see fit to return, the door is always open. As I often say around here, drinking is not mandatory, but it is encouraged. And, of course, a sincere thanks goes out to everyone who took the time out of their schedule to come onto the show and enjoy the madness. And there will be plenty more where that came from, as there always is here, on the open bar of the internet. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra, I'm your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty, everybody!
Soi, 上洛が上長